Hi.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, send me when?
Yeah. I know. I will put later.
Yeah, you can do that. I mean, I'll probably. Yeah. I should manage that myself, but here, what you can't do, get rid of all this crap. No, I think I'm in good shape. I need a time check.
Yeah, when I was at the State Department, we had a very prominent vendor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I wonder if you could take your seats. We're going to start in less than 1 minute. So could everyone please sit down? Could the doors be closed at the back? And it is just 2 o'clock. So let me begin. There is a standard opening. I am supposed to announce the panel number. This is panel number 4602. We are Thursday the 13th of April in UMC Center Ballroom. And we're announcing all this, as you all know, because we are live streaming this event. So this event is going out around the world, and people from around the world can ask questions. And you all can ask questions too.
Very good.
There is a thing I'm supposed to read. In this CWA session, we will utilize both the CWA app. How many of you know what the app is? And how many of you have it? Oh, that's great. So please use the CWA app to ask questions. And if you don't want to do that, we have a note card system.
How many of you don't know what an app is?
Exactly. Well, that's a good question.
Now, those of you that don't know what an app is, we also have a note card system. And with the app, to ask a question, you simply select this session in the schedule, tap Live Q&A, and then insert your question. If you want to use the note cards, then my friend Mark down here, who's standing up, has cards, and he will walk around, and he will give you a note card, and you can fill it out and give it back to him, and he'll bring it up here to me. So you've got lots of ways to ask questions. Students, where are you, students?
Not many.
There's a few students here. Anyway, they get priority. So if you're a student asking a question, please indicate that you are, in fact, a student, and your question is more likely to get put on the schedule to be answered. My name is Carl Tinsman. I'm your moderator for today. I'm a resident of Boulder and of Geneva, Switzerland. I'm on the board of the Boulder Nablus, a sister city, so I do stuff in Palestine. I'm also a polio eradicator. I worked for the UN for 30 years before I retired 10 years ago. I want to now introduce the panelists very briefly. To my left, Maurizio Jetti, who is one of the few people I've ever met who has not only worked for the Nonviolent Peace Force, an organization with which I am associated, but he also now works for NATO. So he's on both sides of conflicts. You can read more about him in your program. And next to him is Larry Greenwood, who you can read more about him also. But what I found notable, if I can find it in here, Greenwood, where are you? He is an old Asia hand par excellence. I mean, he's done everything you can possibly do in Asia. He speaks Japanese fluently, among other things. So, I mean, he's a great person for it. We have a really great panel today. And next to him is Ed Elmendorf, who has equivalent or equal years of international experience, and also, I mean, like 30 years, I think, if I remember correctly. Ed, correct me if I'm wrong. And he also has been associated with the not only the World Bank for 30 years, but also with the United Nations Association that he has been the head of, and he's now the chairman or something of, I think, something like that. Anyway, he's a big guy in the United Nations Association. And finally, last but not least, of course, is our own here in Boulder, Senator Tim Wirth, who, yeah, let's give a shout out for Tim. I'm going to offend him by calling him Tim because you're supposed to call him Senator, but I'm going to call him Tim.
Honorable.
Okay, so with almost no further ado, we're going to have 7-minute opening statements by the panelists, followed by a 2-minute each round of comments on each other. 7-minute max, that is. They've agreed to live within the 7 minutes. And we have the football for Europeans or soccer for Americans system. I will stop them if they exceed 7 minutes. And if they really exceed 7 minutes, then I pull this one out. So, with no further ado, I believe we've agreed that Ed would speak first, and then Larry, and then Tim, and then Maurizio. So, Ed, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Carl. I'm going to have to speak very fast, Carl tells me. Now, what would a world look like with U.S. retreating from alliances? I like the term alliances because it's broad. It isn't just treaties. It isn't just international organizations. It's all sorts of different forms of agreement. And that was clearly the message that was passed by Trump when he was a candidate and was subsequently elected. Not clear what a retreat would imply in terms of relationships with the organizations. It might imply leaving entirely. It might imply reducing financial engagement. It might imply reducing other forms of engagement. The fundamental notion behind this is an effort to return to a kind of Westphalian world where states are fully autonomous. In my mind, that just belies what has happened to the world, particularly in the last 70 years, among other things with globalization. It also implies an effort to retreat from the rules and law-based international order that was created under U.S. leadership at the end of World War II. This is the fundamental problem. What would that world look like? I submit we would have global anarchy and more rather than less conflict. We would have more wars, and we would have a substantial increase in civil conflict within countries. We would have economic decline with less trade. The UN and other global bodies would be greatly weakened.
Dad, you got to talk right into the microphone.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I think U.S. security would actually suffer. But I offer the proposition that the U.S. will learn over time that it has a profound national security interest in the preservation of much of this rules-based international order. How much damage will be done between now and then is a question that could be discussed. We had some of the same kind of phenomena in previous administrations, and they did learn. Whether the current administration will learn is a question that can be discussed. Some of the damage that has been done, the Trump administration announced budget plans, the skinny budget you may have heard about, with an almost 30% decline in the budget of the State Department. Already the U.S. has announced that it will cease its financial participation in the UN Population Fund, UNFPA, and pushing very hard for a cutting of UN expenditures on peacekeeping at a time when peacekeeping services are desperately needed. Yes, we need reform. We need reform of peacekeeping. There's no question about that. But I think reform can be most effectively achieved in a collaborative fashion, and not by threat, not by withholding dues. It didn't work before, and it's been tried, and it won't work now. What does this mean for all of us in this room and beyond? Civic action. I encourage everybody to speak out, to make their views known through all the communities to which you belong. If it's the UN Association, that's great. But there are many, many other bodies, whether they are church groups, education groups, and so forth. It is extremely important that voices be expressed now, that they be expressed in public media, that they be communicated to our senators and our members of Congress. Think about joining the UN Association. You can play a role there. I had the privilege of leading the UN Association into an alliance with the UN Foundation with Tim Wirth here. I was so impressed when I got involved in this about the history of this activity, going back to Eleanor Roosevelt as a volunteer, stumping around the world, around the U.S., in support of the United Nations and the predecessor of the UNA, the American Association for the UN, which you may remember. I became determined to document that. And we recently released a book, and we will... Did a good job, didn't I? We're going to have a book event later this afternoon, and I have a flyer on it if anyone wants it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you for sticking to within the time limits. We're all grateful for that. Next up, I believe, is Larry Greenwood. Sir.
Yeah, thanks. The world hates American leadership, but the world hates even more lack of American leadership. Now, that sounds like an arrogant thing to say, and it is arrogant, but it's true. And so I frankly can't accept the possibility that we wouldn't have American leadership because of the implications and consequences that Ed just mentioned. I mean, it's clearly not going to be in American interest not to exercise leadership. Doesn't mean leadership is easy, but it's definitely in our interest. So rather than go into the question of what the world would look like without the U.S. Leadership, which I think would be Ed's covered very well, and this would be very bad, I'd like to talk about, so what does American leadership actually mean? What is the plumbing of leadership? And as an ex-diplomat, having dealt with transitions in a number of administrations, I just thought I'd give some perspective on that. The first thing that you should need to do to be a leader in the world, to be an American leader, is figuring out what your national interests are and what policy direction you're going to take. And that involves a very wide, it traditionally has involved, a very wide consultation with various stakeholders. It could be, it includes business, it includes think tanks, civil society, bureaucrats in the government. That process actually begins, particularly the think tank part of it, years before the election. I was involved in 2015 in a think tank exercise, putting together recommendations for the next president, to be elected last year. So that's over a year before the actual election. We had to throw out our recommendations because no one anticipated the results of the election. But it starts very early, and that consultation process then gets pulled together through the transition, and hopefully when the administration begins, you have some pretty well-formed ideas about where you want to go, and that's then kind of put together by the White House and by in particular the National Security Advisor. And that's the typical way every administration has done it in the post-war period. And I mean, and this administration is obviously a little behind the curve on the timing of that, because they didn't actually use the transition for that kind of activity. So they are behind. But I would not, I don't personally believe that President Trump doesn't want to be a international leader. I think he does want to be a leader, and he is interested in and continued American leadership, despite what he said during the election. And I think we're beginning to see some of that. I'm not going to talk about specific actions, but I think in terms of some of the people he's appointed, we're seeing signs that, in fact, the U.S. is going to continue its leadership. But it's got to get its act together in terms of how they're doing it. And so they are behind, but they're getting there. I mean, they're beginning now that process. They've lost a number of months in the terms of the preparation, in part because I don't think he didn't think he was going to win either, but also in part that the transition was just not populated with enough people to really get that to happen. And then you got to execute that policy, and you execute it by engagement in lots of different plethora of multilateral and bilateral engagements. And you need resources for that. Ed mentioned the cuts in the State Department and elsewhere. Obviously, you're going to need a lot of boots on the ground, in this case, diplomatic boots on the ground to do that engagement. And so the important part here is that to exercise, I mean, the definition of influence, the definition of leadership, in my mind, is that when a foreign leader wakes up in the morning and he's going to make a decision that has some impact, economic, political security, on America, one of the first things he's going to think of, one of the first 5 things he's going to think of is, what does America think about that? And if you can put yourself in a situation where that is the reality, and that's pretty much been the reality for most of the post-war period. I had some quibbles with President Obama on that because I didn't think he was quite robust enough in that area. But if you have enough engagement and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, every major leader wakes up and if he's going to make a decision that affects America, he thinks, what is America going to think of that? That's influence. And so to do that, you've got to engage, you've got to be out there, you're going to have initiatives. You do have to have focus, though, and so I believe very strongly that you can't belong to everything. Obviously, the major ones, NATO and UN, the multilateral development banks in Asia, I would say APEC, all those are very key institutions. You need to support them. I would argue that you don't need to support directly AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that the Chinese have set up. We don't necessarily need to be that supportive of the East Asian Summit. There's some institutions, and my rule of thumb, I think the most in the post-war rule of thumb has been, if the U.S. is not a leader or the leader of an organization, we should not be active in that organization. If we're going to be leaders, we're going to have to be active. We should belong only to those organizations and be active and use them in those places where we can actually exercise and use them as a tool for that leadership. And so that's one criteria to think about, is we look at what organizations do we need to be active in and which can we kind of, not worry so much about. We have to look about how to leverage our influence. We can't, you don't, as a diplomat, people often ask me, and so how to get people to agree? Do you just, you show your muscle and say, you got to agree with us? You guys are bad because you're making these foreign countries do things that are not in their interests. I have never been involved in any negotiation where I was able to convince the other party to do something that was not in their interests. You have to find the common ground. That's what diplomacy is all about. That's what leadership's all about. And that's true on the Hill, as the senator probably could tell us, and as it is in international diplomacy. So leadership is finding what the other guy wants, creating common ground, and then finding how you can expand that common ground for mutual good. Perception is reality. So perception is really important. So the perception of a U.S. and what we're doing, and see us as a responsible but powerful country, is important. And so I think the Secretary Tillerson, for example, and his attitude towards the press is problematic in my view. I mean, I think to not have the press right there to explain exactly what he's doing, and to not have that close relationship with the press is going to be an impediment to his ability to do his job. And so he's going to need to think about how to kind of expand that access and how to deal with that better. Finally, I would just say that the role of the president in leadership obviously is key. And the most important part of that role is developing a close personal relationship with as many leaders as you can. I mean, sometimes it's just not possible. Kim Jong-un is not somebody I would recommend that the president create a personal relationship with. However, every other leader, including President Putin, it's good to have a strong relationship. I hope I don't I'm not biased in saying this, but because I was a loyal civil servant, worked for both parties throughout my 30-year career in the State Department, but I found George W. Bush to be extremely good at developing those personal relationships, and he worked very hard at developing those bonds with other leaders, so that if we needed, the staff needed an ask from him, he would do it, and he did, and he used those relationships extremely effectively. I would argue that President Obama wasn't as effective in that area. He didn't use, he just was a little bit too of a cold fish and just wasn't into doing that and getting close. I mean, you can't think of a foreign leader that President Obama would be considered close to. Yet I can think of a dozen that George W. Bush was close to. So that's a very important role, and that's a role, frankly, that maybe Mr. Trump is going to be okay. I think that's a strength. He does that kind of. I mean, it's a strength if he tries. Unfortunately, he has come off not the best start with some of our key leaders that he needs to get close to. Fortunately for me, because I'm a Japan guy, that worked out very well. So the relationship between him and Abe was quite good, and he has the potential, I think, to do that. And that's something that he, at least in his previous career, he had to do, and he was actually good at. So I'm mildly hopeful that this will be an area where he, in fact, will take a very active role. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Larry. And next up, we have the Honorable Senator Tim Wirth.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all very much for being here. Let me first of all put in an ad for what Carl and his colleagues at Rotary International have done. I don't know, Carl Tinsman and his have taken on polio. In the 1980s, Rotary decided that they would do everything in their power as an institution, not a government institution, as a private institution, to take on a disease which was at that point infecting 3 or 4 million people, largely very young people around the world. And they've come very close now to getting it to a point, it's in good control now, and getting it right at the edge of eradication, we hope. So Carl, thank you, and Rotary and all that you guys have done. It's just been fabulous. He's been all there.
Thank you for the kind words, Senator. We won't deduct that time from your 7 minutes.
We talk about international alliances. Let me group these a little bit, because this is a very, very large and complicated world out there. So how do you think about it? It seems to me that there are kind of 3 arenas. It's a 3-ring circus, not a circus, but it's sort of 3 big rings. One is a governmental ring, where the government is the major leader and advocate and so on. The second is the non-governmental world, now emerging more and more, very large, very effective, some very small, lots and lots of people involved in it, non-governmental institutions, Rotary being sort of the classic example, very grassroots-based, but big impact globally. And then the third, the private sector, it used to be pretty small in terms of U.S. involvement around the world, now probably is big or not bigger than the other 2 circles altogether. So when we talk about this, let me go back and just talk about what's gone on in the recent memory, last 2 or 3 decades, about what the government's done. If you think about the series of major conferences that the U.S. were central to leading and organizing, advocating, and getting to happen, a series of major global conferences on the new world in which we were emerging. The first of those was a human rights conference. One of the leaders of that for the United States was Bella Abzug, if any of you remember Bella, bouncing in there, and she'd go at it. She was a fantastic advocate. Everybody around the world feared her and loved her, and she was a catalyst for the human rights world in a very, very important way. The Population and Environment Conference in Cairo in 1994, enormously important in terms of legitimizing the power of women, legitimizing the role of women, really giving a sense of their entitlement and engagement in rules that existed then for institutions all around the world. Again, U.S.-led. The conference in Beijing on women, where Hillary made the famous speech, women's rights are human rights are women's rights. Really a dynamic moment. Again, a time of very significant and very important U.S. leadership. The Rio Conference in 1992, which has led most recently to the extremely important agreement in Paris on climate change, again, led by the advocacy of the United States of America. I could go on, but these are examples that have occurred sort of within the lifetime and energy and voting and budgets of all of us here. Not something that U.S. has put a huge amount of money into each one of these, but it was the leadership of the United States of America that made these and so many other institutions work. That's one big part of the role it's played in U.S. alliances. And to think about the U.S. not being there is something that other people have talked about. We can come back and talk about that, but it's pretty stark when you think about how fleshed out that agenda has been, how important it's been for the world, and are we about to rip it up? I think not. Second, the world of NGOs. I think that has grown very significantly. Non-governmental institutions. You know, it used to be at the State Department and at the United Nations, it was impossible for non-governmental institutions to get a hearing. You know, when I was first at the State Department in 1993, we had a major conference of all of the NGOs that were related to the particular unit for which I was responsible. And the State Department forced us to open up a door that had never been opened before. Sort of, you had the feeling that they were asking that all of the people coming in, the NGOs, be fumigated or something before they came into the State Department. It was really astonishing, right? But the State Department has learned, and now the non-governmental institutions are part and parcel of what goes on and increasingly leading the fray in all of the things that the U.S. are doing. You could not possibly implement what the United States wants to see happen around the world without this growing array of very sophisticated, sometimes very well-funded U.S. institutions. And third, of course, the private sector, now becoming more and more important as U.S. trade has grown, U.S. engagement has grown, and more of a voice for supporting, for example, human rights around the world. Go back to where we started. Looking at the advocacy that the United States started, it's U.S. corporations that have largely led the battle, for example, of no more corruption, no more bribery in terms of international negotiations, directly coming out of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, passed in the House of Representatives in the '80s, become part of the behavior of almost every U.S. corporation and now infecting corporations around the world. The role that General Electric is playing in the climate world. You know, they've been really significant, and Jeff Immelt, the head of General Electric, has been to see President Trump, talked to the administration, and been a very strong voice of you have to maintain U.S. engagement in the population conference coming out of Paris. Absolutely imperative. There's nothing in it for the U.S. This is being led, you know, one of the most effective voices, General Electric, not a small mom and pop enterprise, very powerful, very sophisticated, very engaged around the world. So this world in which we're living, you know, has these three major components. And underlying it all, of course, is the military action. You know, the peacekeeping was mentioned by two of my colleagues here. We can come back to that. UN peacekeeping has been very important, besmirched recently in some very, very unfortunate ways, very hard to get a handle on for reasons of governance. Who controls those peacekeepers? They don't work for the United Nations. They work for their own countries. In many cases, the countries are making money on the fact that they're sending troops, you know, to these very difficult places around the world, and their interest is sometimes more their treasury than it is doing good works. Very complicated, difficult, but one in which we're going to succeed. Anyway, I find it's a fascinating endeavor. If you think American politics are interesting, you know, global politics are even more interesting. And how do these pieces sort of feed together? And how do we in the United States become more sophisticated about the extremely important role that we have played in the past and are going to play in the future? Mr. Trump's learning as he goes along. You know, I think don't think he knew much about any of these things. You couldn't have asked him to take a basic junior high school test on almost any one of these issues. But he's obviously a smart guy. He's got some very good people working for him, and let's hope that, you know, they are whispering loudly in his ears. Some of them, let's hope some of them are going down the road, and that others are taking a very big role, because leadership of the United States is absolutely indispensable. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. And finally, last but not least, Maurizio Geri.
Good afternoon. Thank you to be here after lunch. Usually we are a little bit sleepy. I see already someone napping a little bit, but I will be fast. So, following what Larry and Timothy, Honorable, and Edward said, let me add something. You know, as Carl said, I come from Florence, Italy. The Florentine man, the Renaissance man, was the man that was a polymath. He was learning from many areas. That's why, as he said, I have been working for non-violence and also NATO, collective defense. But from Florence, there was also Machiavelli. He wrote The Prince. He spoke about the hegemon, the power of the prince to maintain stability and order. So before to talk about US retreat, we had to talk about US engagement until now, as some of the colleagues said. And more than alliances, I would talk about order, international order. So we know that after World War II, we had the liberal order, thanks to UK and US, the international institutions. But this order, maintained also by the bipolarism of Russia and the US, finished with the so-called unipolar moment, because when Russia disappeared, US for a moment was unipolar. But the unipolar world cannot last, because there is the imperial overstretching. In the academic world, we called it imperial overstretching. There is no one power that can maintain stability for the rest of the world. It's too much, it's too expensive, it's unsustainable. That's why today, after the bipolar world and the unipolar moment, we are in what I define more than multipolar world, as Timothy said, multi-complex disorder. So we are not in order, we are in the disorder, and it's multi-complex. What does it mean? It's multipolar, but it's also complex, very complex, in the sense that the power of the nation state is eroded at lower level by NGOs and different actors, and the higher level by international institutions, European Union, UN. There is therefore a reaction of nation states to this erosion. So the disorder in which we are living now obviously see the ex-hegemon to retreat a little bit, like US it seems to do. But the important thing today is to avoid to go back to the so-called exceptionalism. America first risk to create that exceptionalism that other countries can take. For example, UK can say, I am exceptional. I don't want to stay involved in the European Union problem. But Germany too, at some point, with this narrative, could say, I am exceptional. I am going back über alles, above everyone. So I would suggest to this ex-hegemon, let's call it like that, to avoid the exceptionalism. This means to be engaged in the international institutions, as they said earlier. If we have the International Criminal Court that European Union try to push for every state in the world, why US should not participate? If you have the Arms Trade Treaty, we should engage in this treaty. International institutions, United Nations, the Security Council represent all the world. After World War II, there was UK, France. UK and France, they cannot have two positions, for example, in the UN Security Council. There are the BRICS, there are the Mint. It is not only Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. There are Indonesia, Turkey, Nigeria. There are many countries growing. So these countries need a voice. How can we include the so-called rest in the West liberal order? This is the real issue of today. So someone in the academic world speak about the future of Chimerica, China and America, a bee animal with two heads, you know. This could be, for example, an idea. Use it like Obama did for the climate change with Xi Jinping, or use it with the golf activities of Trump. The important thing is that we understand that 1.5 billion people with that kind of GDP, and in the future also India, will have to have a role in Asia regional stability. Because, as I said, America, or United States of America, because America is all the continent, let's remember that, cannot, because of the imperial overstretching, maintain stability with the protection for every country of the world, with the currency that is controlling the stability of the economy everywhere in the world. We need some convergence. There is Mahbubani, he wrote a very good book, The Great Convergence. He's from Singapore, but Indian scholar. The convergence means that we need to include in the international order the growing economies, the growing powers. How we do that? As I said, reform of international institutions, but also socialization. So welcome these meetings, because many times in the realist vision of international relations, we think that the growing power sooner or later will attack the old hegemon. This happens only if you don't build trust. But if you build trust through socialization, and that's what we had to do, even with countries like North Korea, that is very much isolated, and more isolated you are, and more mistrust you have, and more tendency to attack first you can have. So let's try to socialize. You want to use the basket, you want to use the golf, whatever sport, or other international conferences, is important, I think, to understand that we need to go towards socialization. The last point I want to say is this. Now I speak about soft power, hard power. You know, the hard power, the military economic power of impositions. The soft power is the power of attraction because of the value of the United States. Many people will want to live like here. But when you put together the soft power and this hard power, you call it smart power. The smart power is very important. It means not only to be intelligent, but to balance between the two. Well, today I think we have to pass from the smart power to the shared power. In a way or in another, it's not enough one country to maintain stability around the world. Unless we share, we cannot go on. So how we can recreate these alliances? Because in the meantime that the international order is transitioning towards another order, because now, as I said, we are in the disorder, let's understand each other through needs. For example, there are some needs of satisfaction at local level, not only economically, but also at identity level. In European Union, we say that we have to create the European identity. Well, also here you can create the America identity. With the Latinos, sooner or later we will have to integrate regionally. There is a Friedman, he spoke about the next 100 years. Mexico, that now is in disarray because of the drug war, sooner or later will have an important relationship with the United States, because it's one of the few countries that can control two oceans, like Canada and like United States. And who control the oceans many times can give some support of stability. So let's create some alliances at regional level and also some reform of international institutions at global level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maurizio. Now we're about to go on to 2 minutes from each panelist on commenting on what each one of them has said. But before we do that, I have neglected to do one important task. I want to introduce to you two of the most important people in the room. These are your producers for this panel. They're responsible for crowd control, for questions, and for all kinds of things. First, right down here in front of me is Corey Giannini. And just a few years older, off to my right, is Mark Roschkind. They do have the note cards for asking questions, so anybody who wants to ask a question, just raise your hand and you get a note card. Now, to prepare the panelists for commenting on each other's presentations, let me just ask one question. Larry, you said that a most important part of the role of the president is developing strong personal relationships with other national leaders. And so we see Mr. Trump hanging up the phone on the Australian Prime Minister. We see him loving President Putin until yesterday when he announces that he doesn't love him so much anymore. How's Mr. Trump doing on developing those personal relationships? This is a question for all of the panelists as well as commenting on each other. Each one has 2 minutes. Larry, you want to begin?
Well, it's probably too much time to spend on this, actually, because I think, as I said, he's off to a bad start on this. But my point was that he's just looking at his personality plus looking at. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. as I said in the earlier remarks, Mr. Trump has gotten off to a shaky start when it comes to developing close relationships with foreign leaders. In addition to the examples you mentioned, his meeting with Angela Merkel was obviously awkward. So he's got to work on that. On the positive side, he had a great bilateral with Abe. Even though it was maybe physically uncomfortable for Mr. Abe, the hug was a bit much, but that's okay. That's getting in the right direction. It's okay. And the Xi visit also seemed to go off pretty well. So I think it's just these are early days. So I'm just saying that given Mr. Trump's personality, given his what seems to be what he likes to do, which is kind of get in there and talk to people in a private kind of setting, and I'm told he can be quite charming in that kind of setting. That this might be his strength. So kind of stay away from the Twitter, work on the personal relationships.
Okay, Ed, you want to go next?
Sure. I want to underscore messages from Tim Wirth and particularly the others about the erosion of the power of governments. In a world where the formal responsibility, legal responsibility, does lie with governments, this complicates life a lot. But as Tim indicated, over the last 30 years, the roles of NGOs at the level of individual countries as well as globally has become incredibly important. And I think this is a development that we should all welcome. The same applies to the world of business. And in the future international community, we need to reconcile and engage with all of those parties. Now, I want to make a further comment about U.S. leadership. I heard a lot of stress from Tim Wirth and Larry Greenwood about the importance of U.S. leadership. I'd like to give that a little bit of a nuance. And I would prefer to use the term U.S. engagement. U.S. leadership, for me, tends to connote being out in front all the time. I think the U.S. may often be more effective by engaging privately. The UN Human Rights Council, established in 2005, the U.S. didn't join at all, and that became a not very credible body. In 2009, President Obama decided the U.S. would engage, and the performance of the Council improved significantly, although the U.S. was in no sense a formal leader. That being said, U.S. diplomacy was very, very seriously and actively engaged in the Human Rights Council, as I'm sure, Tim, you remember, and the record improved considerably. So I'd like to suggest the notion of U.S. engagement being perhaps more important than formal U.S. leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And Senator Tim Wirth.
Well, I think you're right, Ed, but leadership takes a lot of different forms. In good diplomacy, sometimes you're out front and sometimes you're no fingerprints. So, we do that well. We have a very, very good foreign service, and they ought to be rewarded in every way. But to go to the question about Trump, the theme running through everything that we have talked about is that we believe that there ought to be a rules-based regime. All of these items that we've been talking about, all these issues we've been talking about, we talk about a certain set of rules. And we're trying to get those established and trying to get everybody to agree to that set of rules, or put it a different way, to a set of norms. It's a rules-based, it's a norms, there are a set of norms, expected behavior. That's what we're generally after. Now, I'm not sure that either of those words, rules or norms, would be used to characterize Donald Trump. I don't think that he has much of a sense of what what kind of rules there are. I don't think he's ever played in a world of consistent rules or consistent norms. His style has been a very different one. His history has been a very different one. But how is he going to conform, his own personal history and the way in which he has succeeded in a very complicated, difficult business world, but in which a lot of rules and norms aren't necessarily the way in which that business is governed. So I think there's a potential real contradiction here. I hope he learns rapidly and becomes, well accustomed to, what we're trying to accomplish together with 194 other countries in the world.
Maurizio.
Yes, Carl, the leadership style is very important. I think I spoke about the international system, but we have to speak about agency. We call it the individual level, international relations. And obviously, as they said already, we pass from one model that was the cooperative model of Obama, coming from an intellectual and an educator, to a competitive model that is coming from a businessman. Because we had Berlusconi for 20 years in Italy. It was a similar attitude. Competitive means you use stick and carrots. It's okay, sometimes competition is very good. You have to ask to NATO members to pay the fair share. I will, threat tariffs if you don't make the price right. But attention with the stick and carrots attitude, because, okay, competition, but not patronizing, because culture matters. And here we have experts about Asian cultures, and pat on the shoulders, on this kind of top-down or major minor positions that in business can be good to show the power, but in diplomacy sometimes is not very good. So I would suggest that the leadership style with the colleagues of the president can suggest how take care about cultural communication, intercultural communication, and the importance of status, pride in other countries, for example, in particular in Asian countries. So let's see the future how it's going, but it seems quite interesting.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for staying pretty much on time. That gives us 30 minutes for questions, which I consider a great victory. So we're going to move on to questions. I'm going to pose one first that I want to give the panelists time to think about, and then I'm going to pose another one or two for them to comment on immediately. The one to think about: could each panelist list the 5 alliances most important first, which they feel would have grave results if the U.S. withdraws its involvement? So we'll give them a few minutes to think about that one and listing them. And then while they're thinking about that, they can perhaps answer this question. Given Trump's lack of knowledge of other countries and his hasty and indelicate actions in response to situations, could he ruin American credibility more, leading to a lack of American leadership accepted by other countries? So who would like to take that question? That's directed to any of the panelists. Repeat the question. Given Trump's lack of knowledge of other countries and his hasty and indelicate actions in response to situations, could he ruin American credibility, leading to a lack of American leadership accepted by other countries?
Let me start, and I'll try that. Let me go back to what I was saying about rules and norms. I think that he's being pulled in 2 ways. If you look at Bannon, Bannon obviously is somebody who is really hostile to any framework of rules or norms and wants to break them all down. I mean, he's been very proudly assertive of a non-rules-based world, a non-accepted set of norms. I think that's been pushing Trump in these first 100 days significantly, it appears to be. And then there's another side of this where he is coming along and saying, well, NATO doesn't look so bad after all. Maybe we ought to recognize a single China. Maybe there ought to be, a number of things. He is moving back, to what would appear to be, at least in the last few days, he seems to be moving back toward a more acceptable a norm. Let's hope that that's the case.
Anybody else? Larry?
I mean, the good news is that the U.S. has built up through its efforts, including those of people like Senator Worth, over the years, that we've got this political reservoir of goodwill, essentially, particularly with our allies. And our allies desperately want us not to screw this up. And so the result is that Mr. Trump is, certainly in the countries that I kind of follow, I mean Japan in particular, he's getting a lot, he's got a, you know, they're cutting him some slack, right? I mean, they want him to come around, and they're not going to run away if he says a few crazy things. They are willing to cut him some slack and see what happens. And so I think over time, if the behavior doesn't get better, that's going to be a problem. But I think people are going to give him some latitude here because they just so desperately want us to get this right.
Yeah, I think that they will cut some slack and give time, but I would like to submit that credibility can be damaged and destroyed much more rapidly than it can be built up. And once seriously damaged, it takes a long, long time to recover.
Good point.
If folks have not seen the Netherlands is number 2, all the number 2 videos, if you know what I'm talking about, you should definitely take a look at that. I mean, right there from the start, our credibility was frankly hurt, right? That's a good point.
Yes. It's said soft power is very important. So what are the credibilities based on values? Values of tolerance, respect of diversity. So as I said, we need to communicate with sensibilities. But going back to what you asked about the alliances, I would say that the farthest alliances are very important because a retreat, for example, from East Asia, Japan or South Korea, would create instability there. But also a retreat from Middle East, I'm talking about mostly Turkey because it's inside NATO. And now we have difficulties on maintaining a relationship or many domestic issues. And then obviously European Union. I mean, this is the most important alliance that maintains stability. And then closest to here. So the farthest ones are the ones that are crucial. Closest to here is very important too, Mexico, Canada, the NAFTA. But if you go far, they are even more important than the closest one.
Okay, let me pose another question, not from me, but submitted from the audience. Is it possible that Trump may be using his rhetoric to achieve better outcomes without actually intending to follow through? This is to any panelist. And we don't have to have all panelists answer every question. But anyone want to take a stab at that one? No. All right. Well, then we can move on to the next
It's
question.
a very risky strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very, very risky if you're starting to deal with real bullets here. And thinking about what's he saying about NATO and what's he saying about Ukraine. Is Tillerson saying Ukraine's not important, and yet we're saying NATO is important? Or what's he saying about Syria? Are we going in or out of Syria? What the president says is exceedingly important. Ambiguity doesn't get you anywhere. It just confuses people, and I think that corrodes his overall authority. Let's hope he's learning that. Again, I would mention that I think sort of lurking back there is this Bannon character, who loves this, I guess, this chaos. Apparently, what do I know? You read the same things that I do. But he's really liking this kind of chaos, and I think Trump's starting to understand that this isn't getting him anywhere. It's not advancing what he wants to do, and it's certainly not moving him down a road, toward re-election, which is obviously on his mind. Every politician thinks about re-election all the time. So I mean, so I think we're seeing an evolution of this, and let's hope it continues.
Ed, very briefly, go ahead.
Do you want an answer to your 5 priorities in the alliances?
Sure.
Okay. My list is the United Nations, NATO, entities not mentioned thus far, international financial institutions, which buttress the international economic order, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the EU.
Okay, and that prompts me to pose one of the other questions that was asked. What would likely happen if the United States pulls out of the Paris Accord on the environment?
Well, I think it'd be very corrosive of U.S. leadership around the world. Here, an awful lot of work was done to engage. I think there are 170 or 180 countries who've now signed on to Paris. It was not easy. These are not easy negotiations at all. And getting that many people lined up and committed to this set of goals, albeit there are a set of goals, there's no great enforcement mechanism. There are a lot of things that have to be worked out in terms of measurement. There are a lot of issues engaged in this, but the framework is still there. So pulling us out, I think, would be really damaging to the United States. Would it be fatal to the global climate agreement? No. Would it slow down the global climate agreement? Probably significantly. Would it kill it? I don't think so. But I don't know what he gets out of this other than, a moment, Jesse Jackson once said about teenage pregnancy, he said, a momentary thrill, a long-term chill. It seems to me that you get a, there's a momentary thrill about this of saying, well, that was what I said during the campaign, but it's a long-term loser from his perspective, and I think that appears to be what Tillerson thinks. It certainly is what Mattis thinks. It's certainly what members of his family seem to think, so that's encouraging.
Okay, if nobody else further on that one, this one's from a student. How will the rise of populist movements affect the United States' relationships with their allies? And I assume he or she is talking about populist movements not only in the United States, but in other places we can think of, like France and Germany and Holland and places like that.
I'll give it a try. Negatively. The emphasis of the populist movements has been very much what's going on within individual countries and their ability to control that. It is in part a response to globalization. It is in part a response to the enormous growth of business around the world. It's in part a response to the importance of the NGO community as well. Thanks.
Anybody else? Larry?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think when we look at the specifics of populism outside of the United States, I think the U.S. certainly has been, that populism is driven in many cases by economic issues. But in Europe, it looks mainly to be driven by immigration. So the UK wants to leave, but in fact, they're not interested in less economic integration with Europe. They're just worried about immigration. So it's possible that the problem is a bit more narrow than, maybe I should put it another way. We shouldn't exaggerate some of the economic causes of populism around the world, and because in fact we're not seeing a rise of protectionism. The numbers show that, in fact, I mean, although trade is not growing as fast as GDP, doesn't seem to be because the barriers are going up around the world. Now we have to watch that space carefully. But immigration clearly is an issue, and that's one that we've all kind of got to work together with. But I guess I'm not quite as worried about populism as some of the other issues.
Mauricio.
Yeah, I am instead.
Except here.
Yeah,
This is the place I'm worried about populism, is America.
Well, I think a little bit slightly differently that for me this melting with the domestic issues in other countries is very dangerous, because almost more than retreat from alliances or international treaties, because international treaties will go on. But to meddle, how do you say it, with the domestic issues is very dangerous, because today there is an emotion in the population that is not addressed, and narratives like the ones of external leaders, even if they change every 5 minutes, can be good in business style, confusing the other people, but is not good in the diplomatic arena, and is not good in the domestic arena, because it requires time to create these alliances and also to develop democratic, strong governments in our countries. And then suddenly arrive an external important leader that says, okay, maybe Le Pen should be supported, and suddenly the people, okay, maybe they say, okay, let's follow this. So I think it's a very dangerous, this kind of meddling with the domestic politics.
Let me try a very different response. What are we afraid of? what are we afraid of in terms of people's engagement and more broad engagement and so on? What if we started from the point of view of what an opportunity is provided to us by this surge of citizen involvement in the United States and around the world? How do we react to that, and how do we recalibrate our institutions accordingly? I don't know what the answer to that is, but there's something going on out there, and I think that the wrong thing to do is to say, whoa, hold it up, da, 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 da. Rather, we're much more likely to be successful as a democratic government if we figure out how to engage this energy and how to engage this set of issues and how to answer the kinds of problems that are created, and not resist. The more we resist, this kind of power that's out there, the less likely we are, it seemed to me, to be able to govern effectively.
But if I may add to that, that engagement presupposes listening and being in touch with people who think very, very differently. And yet, the demography of this country seems to be separating people more and more into communities of very, very different views. And I think the rise of populism imposes on all of us an imperative of reaching out beyond our own communities for dialogue. Thanks.
Okay, next we have one more from a student, and of course student questions get priority. I don't want you older people claiming to be a student. This one from a student says, do you feel that economic and trade relations or social and personal relations are more valuable to the success and prosperity of the United States? I presume the question is about Mr. Trump's policies and relationships. So economic and trade relations or social personal relations more valuable?
Well, since I guess
Senator?
well, I mean, obviously both. So, I mean, you have to have a good message to sell. So if you have a policy that, I mean, maybe we can start with the slogan "America First." It's not a great talking point in diplomacy. So it's, yeah, you have to have a slightly better product to sell than that if you're going to go overseas and get people to do what you want them to do. So you have to start. That's why I said you got to start with your national interests and your policies that you're going to be promoting, that are in your interest. But you also then have to figure out, they have to be good not just for you but for the world. And I think it's important that, I mean, in some ways that does make us exceptional. And not that other countries can't think in the same way, but at least in terms of actions we've taken. The U.S. has been known as a country that doesn't just think about its short-term national interests, but does, in fact, think about and act on. I mean, the agreements that Senator Worth mentioned at the beginning of this program are examples of that. Human rights and climate and war crimes. These are things that are not maybe short-term interests for the United States, but they're certainly in our medium and long-term interests, but they're also in the interest of the world. And we, more than other countries, frankly, have been not only thought about it, but have the power to deliver those kinds of outcomes. So you have to start there. And then, frankly, personal relationships are the tool for getting it done.
Good answer. Both hands.
Yeah. Let me just underscore one of the things that Larry said. It's not just America first, but it is our national interests. And we shouldn't hesitate to think in those terms. We may make policy decisions in those terms. As Larry says, we do need to think in longer-term national interest. No question about that. But we shouldn't expect that the U.S. or other countries will behave in any way other than what they perceive to be in their national interest.
Okay, let's move on to the next student question. I'm taking this on faith about these students. Does the commitment or the lack thereof, the lack of commitment, of Trump to his campaign promises indicate a corrosion of the social contract? And if so, is the social contract more important for America and therefore global stability than international treaties?
Okay,
Does the
Almondor,
panel want me to
Yeah,
repeat
I
it?
think that's yours, Tim.
We think you're really good at this question. Right? Larry and I decided to point to you.
The campaign promises, particularly as articulated subsequently also by Steve Bannon, sure might involve some element of erosion of a social contract as understood by very many of us. But remember also that the tone and promises, whether articulated and summarized as "Make America Great Again" or bringing jobs to people whose jobs may have been undermined by globalization and dramatic economic and technological change, those people and their views are important, and they are important in a social contract in this country. And if we ignore those views, we are at risk.
Yes.
Anybody else?
I want to
Mauricio.
say something too, because the Roman Empire declined because of the weakness, internal weakness, before the external invasions. So I think the internal cohesion is very important. And when we talk about social contract, the unity of the people here, reducing the divisions and reducing the polarization will be much more important than the international alliances for maintaining the strength of US.
And as a practical matter, it's probably not good to hold a politician to every single one of his or her campaign promises. It can be very dangerous.
I think it's a very, we stop and think, we're all sort of musing on this. I think it's very interesting to think about what is the social contract in the United States. What are the common themes that we presumably agree with? And what are the socializing influences in the United States that help us to continue to achieve that? And I think that raises a lot of interesting questions. I mean, when most of us were in school, you'll remember that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, like in 4th grade, 7th grade, and 10th grade, all across the country. Everybody took American history. Everybody read the Constitution. There are now, whole school systems where there are no civics taught whatsoever. There's no kind of common agreement. We all used to watch the evening news, and there was a sense of ABC, NBC, CBS. There was a commonality to that, and that doesn't exist anymore. There was a draft, and like it or not, there was a common responsibility that most men in the country felt and were part and parcel of. There is no such thing anymore. There are a lot of pressures, it seems to me, that are pulling against a kind of I would call it a kind of cohesion. Maybe that's a social contract, but I think there is pulling against this kind of cohesion. Should English be the language of the United States of America? There's perfectly reasonable argument that it should be, that there are needs and ways in which should everybody be allowed to vote? Absolutely. There are certain commonalities that we ought to be searching for. Now, it is politically incorrect to have that discussion largely, and I think that's a big mistake. I personally think that we're really missing the boat on a number of questions like this, of really thinking about how are people being socialized into the ideas of what America is, what it has been, what its dreams are. They're not, there are a lot of problems, of course, but there's some commonalities that it seems to me, and maybe that goes to the question that was being asked. At least that got me to thinking about what is that social compact. We don't talk about it. We're kind of afraid to talk about it, and I think we ought to.
Yeah, I would like to
briefly.
Yes, that there are two legs in the social contract. One is the unity, but the other one is the unity of the people. The other one is the trust in the party and in the politicians. And here you are honorable, but we have the party system crisis in Europe, anti-establishment feelings, and this is the problem of the social contract. So unless we have the reconnection between the civil society organizations and our representatives, that's how the populism comes out, the nationalism comes out, because There is these demagogues, they say, okay, I will have the voice of the people against the establishment, and the social contract destroyed. That's how fascism started also for us in our time 100 years ago. So I suggest that this distance between the politicians and the citizens has to be reduced in a way or in another.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for those comments. Now, fortunately, I think we've exhausted the students. I don't have any more student questions. But we only have 7 minutes left. So we're going to go to lightning responses. I would ask each panelist, if you're going to comment, keep it less than 1 minute. I am reminded that the request for the 5 most important alliances question was answered only by 1 panel member, and we'd like to hear from the other 3. And while they're doing that, I want to pose a question that was submitted over the app. And this is an easy 1-minute answer for you guys. Please comment on the practice of sending vague messages about U.S. policy through Twitter. I don't make these up, huh? Who wants to go?
I said alliances already.
I agree with Elmendorf on the list of 5.
Alliances.
What about Twitter, guys?
What's wrong with Twitter? Twitter is a very, very powerful tool. We should think about its use, its abuse, how it can serve social purposes.
I was actually against television for a long time, but I'm now.
Yeah, I mean,
That's a point.
I mentioned Twitter already, so I won't repeat that. But but if you're going to use Twitter, and obviously President Obama used Twitter actually quite effectively, but he did so in a very controlled environment, and it was, you know, things were thought through, and it was not off the cuff. And so it's not so much the tool that of Twitter; it's how you use it. And it can be used effectively, obviously.
And
Should I take advantage of the mic just to say my allies are going to be pretty standard, though. I mean, for me, Japan. I mean, it's in terms of both military and economic, probably the most important. Europe clearly would be the second, and then actually I would put Mexico and Israel there as well. Mexico, it's not a future thing. Actually, the relationship is very important right today. And then I'm going to put it the 5th as a group of countries, so a little bit unfair, but the Southeast Asians, the ASEANs.
Okay, thank you. Moving on. No, this one's even better. What happens internationally if Trump is removed via impeachment? 1 minute, no more than 1 minute, gentlemen.
Cheers. Cheers is my answer.
Cheers. Ed.
This is the power of our democratic institutions, that we do have ways in this country of managing difficult transitions. Think about the resignation of President Nixon. That was a very dramatic change all of a sudden. And yet, our democratic institutions managed that. I am convinced that if President Trump were to leave office in some way we don't need to talk about, that the institutions of this country could indeed cope with it. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think, apart the cheers or the hurrah in some people, I think it will confirm the American democratic strength, because this will mean that everyone can become president, but not everyone can mess it up.
Well said. Well said, Marcio. Okay. We only have about 2 minutes left, guys. Should the U.S. be a member of and subject to the International Criminal Court?
Yes, of course the U.S. should be a member. Will the U.S. be a member in the foreseeable future? Probably not. And it's not worth the political capital to try to ratify the Rome Treaty, but it is worth a lot of investment of ideas and people to follow the International Criminal Court, to mold it where we can informally and behind the scenes, but don't spend time and energy on Senate ratification of the Rome Treaty.
Yeah, I agree in the sense that, but this will not so much for their own responsibilities, but to legitimize more and more international institutions as tools and norms, as Honorable said.
Anybody else on that one? No. Okay, and this may be the last question because we've got about 1 minute or two at the most left. What, if any, efforts are being made for peaceful reunification of North and South Korea? What should the United States do? In 1 minute.
Got our East Asian scholar here. I think
Go for
Well,
it.
no, I mean, there's not a 1 minute answer. There was a panel on this earlier this week, so I think that I would just refer people back to that. Clearly we're going to have to. I mean, the answer is, but I don't know if we could get there. Is that China has to, and Japan, U.S. and South Korea have to come to be in consensus about how to proceed again with North Korea. With strong Chinese support, we can get there, but we have to make it worthwhile to the Chinese, and we also have to find a way to accommodate the leader in the North. But the real key is going to be China and how we can incent China to do what it needs to do.
Anybody else on that
Yes,
one?
I will go with one word: reconciliation. The forgotten war, 3 million people of the Korean War, with a ceasefire and not a peace treaty. These things in Asia matters, history matters, and this guy is the son of the person that was during the war. So I would suggest that some type of, reconciliation, because at the end of the day, these people more isolated and more afraid you are, and more possible attacks you can do.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank you all. You've been a great audience. And I want to thank our moderators. And I'm sorry we haven't gotten to all the questions. I had more than 10 questions left that I couldn't ask. Please clear the room. We have another panel coming in 15 minutes. And thank you very much to the panelists.
Thank you.